Today we celebrate what is called Ascension Sunday. It doesn't fall on a Sunday. Actually, it's 40 days after Easter, so it's always on a Thursday, but it is one of the major feasts of the church, which means we can celebrate it on a Sunday instead of the actual day when it occurs in time. So today you will see in the front of your service leaflet a little picture that I want to refer to from time to time in my sermon because it has a lot to do with how we see and how we interpret Jesus' ascension into heaven, and it also has a lot to do with how we interpret heaven, what it is, where it is, and how we encounter it. So I thought it would be fun today to ponder this picture a little bit. What you see here is an image that was painted by Salvador Dali back in 1958, and it's just called The Ascension. And it calls forth for us a bunch of different questions about how we look at the event that we read about today in Luke and in Acts. And so that you can get a little bit of a background here, Luke was, as you know, a gospel writer who wrote in about 70 or 75 AD and was telling of the things that had been passed down to him. And in the very beginning of his gospel, he says, I want to write about the things so you'll know what happened. And he wrote about them all during Luke. And the very last verse of Luke is what we read from today. Luke then also wrote Acts. And Acts is the beginning of the time after the day of Ascension and Pentecost, and Luke wrote about that as well. So you have two different versions here of the same event, which is Christ's ascension into heaven. Luke tells us more about that in his gospel and in Acts than any of the other gospel writers ever talk about. The last section of Matthew doesn't even discuss the ascension. It discusses Matthew's or Jesus' commissioning of his disciples that is probably very familiar to you, where he tells the disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. But Luke's version is this. Luke's version is Christ ascending to heaven and leaving behind whatever is left behind for the disciples. So that's the question we're addressing today. What is left behind for the disciples, and where, pray tell, is Jesus going? Because, as you may remember, after the crucifixion, Christ appeared in a room where the disciples were huddled and afraid. They realized that it was Christ, and they had gotten him back. But they only had him back for about 38 days. And all of a sudden, on Ascension Day, he's gone again. So imagine their questions. What does this mean for us? What do we do now? So take a look at the picture, if you would. It's really interesting. You can't really tell, unless you knew that it was titled Ascension, that Christ is coming or going. You don't know if he's ascending or descending. If you look at his feet, it doesn't show up too well here. This is not a color picture, but they're dirty. They are cast with dirt all over them, which is probably normal because Christ walked around in sandals all the time. And you remember he had to wash the disciples' feet and wanted them to wash his at the Thursday before his crucifixion. So there's a lot going on here with Dali. And you wonder, if you look at this picture, is the prominence of Christ's feet suggesting that he's about to set foot in time, in a new time, or is this his going away to a timeless eternity? So it's there for our interpretation, depending upon what we see and what we believe about this picture. So there are really a lot of questions about what this is a depiction of, which I think may be what Dali was intending for us to conjure up by this image. Perhaps these questions are indicative of our own questions about this event. Where was Christ going? At that time, people thought the earth was flat and heaven was up there. Well, with Galileo, we learned that we are an earth that is sort of suspended in a huge universe. So depending on which way the earth is pointing, heaven could be up there, or heaven could be over here, or down here. So there are all sorts of interpretations from which we can let our mind wander as we're pondering this. To me, the biggest and most important part of this image is the outstretched arms of Christ. It's as if he is wrapping himself around the center of the being and the presence of what is going on around him. And he's doing like this. And so those outstretched arms, and perhaps even the almost tortured appearance of the fingers, could mean a lot of different things. And we don't know what they meant for Dali. But it could be that this is a depiction of Christ. This is the unifying event for Christ and the world that Christ was leaving behind. There's something in theology called the particularity of Christ coming to the earth and being crucified. The story occurs as a Jewish man in a place, a small little corner of the world, that came into lives of people then and there and affected the lives of people then and there. So if that's the purpose, why didn't God make Jesus born as an Indian on the plains of this country way back when we know that Indians actually roved the face of this country? Why didn't God make Jesus a little Swedish baby in Northern Europe? Why didn't God make Jesus a little African baby from Ethiopia? And we don't know the answer to that question, but we do know the answer to this question, that Jesus coming to earth was an event from which we all learned and was a signal to us of God's love for us. And Jesus' ascension appears to me to be a gathering of all of humanity into Jesus' body and heart to carry us back to God. So if I'm right about that, or even if I'm not right about that, it's got to mean something of these outstretched arms. Jesus' arms were outstretched to every human being he encountered during the time that he walked the face of the earth. Why is there no face in this picture? You don't see Jesus' face. Maybe the reason is that face could be ours. Maybe Dali wants to imagine for us that face could be ours. It's a universal face because there's no face. It's a body, and the body's going upward, signifying the entire body of Christ ascending to the heart of God. It looks to me to be a gathering up, a time at which Christ said, I have been here on this earth for my mission, and now I'm going to complete my mission by returning to the Father, which is exactly what Jesus said in the Gospel of John. So what is left for us is Jesus' Spirit. And that's what he tells the disciples both in Acts and in Luke. I will send my Spirit upon you. And that's what we hear next Sunday on Pentecost Sunday. In the Gospel of Luke here, Christ talks about past, present, and future. He talks about everything was written about me in the law of Moses and the Psalms and the prophets. So through the Old Testament, Moses and the Psalms and the prophets, they act almost as if they are a feeding tube to show us what would happen when Christ came into the world. And then in verse 46 of Luke's Gospel, he says, the Messiah suffers, is crucified, buried, and risen, and people are forgiven. That is the present event about which he's speaking. And then he says for the future in Luke's Gospel, Stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. He's telling them what will happen next. I think as much as anything, this image is important to us as sort of a way for us to contemplate our own resurrection and our own afterlife. And if we do that, we can conjure up all sorts of things about what it might be like. But in fact, we can't really know, can we? There's a new book that just came out last week. It's called Resurrection in Retrospect. And it was written by a guy who was my systematic theology professor at General Seminary. And in fact, it's dedicated to the students of General Seminary at that time. Peter Carnley is the author. He's the former Archbishop of Australia. And what he does is he talks about looking at the resurrection and what it really means for us. And in fact, he takes aim at a very prominent New Testament professor and theologian named N.T. Wright, who had written a book about 15 years prior. And the book that N.T. Wright had written said something, it was 900 pages, it's hard to encapsulate, but said something about belief in the resurrection is simply belief that Christ physically was risen and walked the face of the earth after his removal bodily from the grave. Archbishop Carnley, lovely man, says, no, it's more than that. It's so much more than that. It says that the world of Jewish and Hellenistic thought at the time had a much broader vision of what resurrection was. And he says that Dali is showing, he doesn't say, I say that I think Dali is showing us the very same thing from this painting. Our interpretation of the resurrection in heaven doesn't need to be fixed in stone. It doesn't need to be concrete, and it's not just about whether Christ in fact walked the face of the earth. What it means is that everywhere and in every age, Christ is available to us. He was available through the prophets and through the Psalms. He was available on earth during the time that he was here, and he's available to us now in spirit because of the fact that Peter Carnley says what the resurrection is about is the immortality of the soul. We know that when we die, our body changes. Sometimes it is placed in the earth. Sometimes it is made into ashes and thrown into the wind or into the sea. But in all instances, our soul remains immortal. And the image that we have in this painting from Dali can help us understand, I think, that the resurrection itself is something we can only contemplate, but something that we should contemplate, something that we are given clues and hints about in the Bible, still nothing concrete. If two professors as articulate and learned as N.T. Wright and Peter Carnley can differ about what the resurrection really means and how it really occurred, so can we. So if you are tied to a certain belief about what the resurrection was and how it happened, or where heaven is, or if heaven exists in time or place, don't be discouraged. That can change. It can remain the same. But what's important is that you know that Jesus is wherever heaven is, holding and wrapping his arms around you and all of us here every day. Sometimes we don't feel that, but it's always there. So our call as Christians in this church and in the world is to make that known, to those around us, that they too can be a part of that kingdom, wherever it exists, wherever it displays itself through another human being or through an event of life. One more thing I want to call your attention to. If you'll pull out the insert in your leaflet, at the top it says June 2018. And on the left-hand side, it's got little Aiden's birthday right there. We're going to celebrate that in a minute. But then below that, there is about a half a page that is sort of a motto that I think we are taking on here at St. Luke's, and that I hope that we continue to take on. It's this: demonstrating God's love through Christ to the community and to the world. That's what we do here. That's what we're trying to get better at, and that's what I hope we can all get better at and achieve together. But we are God's living sacraments. You can see in the stained glass window in front of you different symbols. And there's a lot of symbols in churches, and someday we'll have time and we'll talk about what those symbols are and what they mean. But this painting by Salvador Dali is a symbol. It's a symbol of an interpretation and an event in his perception. But in truth and in fact, we are the symbols of Christ's presence. We are the symbols that go out into the world and display Christ's presence. Now, when I go to the grocery store and have to wait in line too long, I may not be in a really good mood to display Christ's presence, but I'm called to do that. It's difficult. I don't always do it as well as I should, and neither do any of you. But that's what we're called to do. And I think that's what this depiction by Salvador Dali is meant to be. We are meant to be those arms. We are meant to be the arms that wrap around those not only that we love, but also those that we have a hard time loving on any given day or at any given time in our life. So if we can remember that from this image, take it home with you, ponder it, look at it, have your own interpretation about what these things mean. And I believe that you too may understand that Christ rising to heaven was the event that made it our job now to be him on earth, to act as he acted on earth, to wrap our arms around every human being and demonstrate Christ's love for the world.